Hello everybody, my name is Jarrett and welcome back to my channel. We are going to be continuing our discussion about Dead Like Me. We are in Season 2, Episode 9. This episode is called Be Still My Heart. So while this episode's biggest theme is coffee and how the different characters use it to kind of get through their days, there is a central theme about love and loss and being alone, and most importantly, sexuality. We already saw in the last episode that George was having these kind of sexual feelings start to awaken inside of her, and we're seeing the end result of all of that. This episode largely focuses on George, on Reggie, and on Daisy, and everyone else are kind of just side characters to kind of drive that story. Rube is on his way to go figure out what happened with this letter. He's leaving Roxy in charge, and he basically tells her that he sent this letter to somebody after he died. It never got where it was supposed to go, and he's trying to track it down. So he packs a bag and he dips, and Roxy's gonna be in charge in the next episode. Roxy's doing her thing. She's being a cop. She's kind of just existing on the sidelines again, like how she did through a lot of Season 1. The mistreatment of Roxy for the rest of the season is slightly infuriating because she had such a big arc. I don't know if it was because Jasmine Guy was busy or if it was just because they wanted to focus on other characters, but I really wish that Roxy had a bigger spotlight rather than just kind of being relinquished to a side character, because at this point she's not really going to do much more other than give a couple of quippy one-liners. She had a conversation with Daisy about the cross being gone, and she even asks, did she lose her faith or her cross? And Daisy says she lost both of them. Roxy's picking up on these little cues about Daisy. She still doesn't like her, but she's intuitive. She berates Daisy later for not doing her job properly. And this is why Roxy was picked to be in charge while Rube is gone, because she's the most responsible and she's the one who calls everybody out when they're not doing their jobs properly. We got a surprise Clancy appearance. He hasn't been in most of the season so far. Reggie confirms that he was dating Charlotte, the character from Season 1, and they've now broken up, and he's kind of just living his bachelor life in his cheesy condo, not really eating much food and kind of just getting whatever takeout happens. Joy is really even a side character in this episode. She exists in this episode purely to drive Reggie's story, that Reggie is not doing her homework, she's not doing really what she's supposed to do, and Joy, after the last episode, being around her mother, Joy is realizing how disconnected she is from her own daughter, so she's trying to make efforts in the same way that she did in Season 1, where she's pretty much willing to do anything to try to get into Reggie's good graces, even if that means doing her homework for her. And Clancy had the audacity and the gall to say, well, that's cheating, and you know how I feel about cheating. Cheating on homework is one thing, but cheating on your wife with a college co-ed is not? Like, what? Reggie eventually gets both of her parents to do her homework for her, and she presents them both to the class. And the homework that Clancy comes up with is this Shakespeare poem about how you should have kids so that you're never really alone, tackling that conversation that the whole episode is trying to have about aloneness. We see this kind of paralleled with Joy, with not wanting to be alone. So she's doing things to try to get her daughter's favor. We also get a foreshadow moment to one of the most unfortunate moments that happens in the series coming up. And in this episode, near the end, Reggie leaves the gate open and JD gets out and goes and hangs out with Clancy for a few minutes. But this is a foreshadow moment to something awful that's gonna happen, and I'm not ready for it because I cry every freaking time. And we also get a mention of Gail, who is a character that we are going to see a little bit more in coming episodes. We also find out that Reggie isn't really a huge fan of being at her dad's house, and she's really only going because it's court ordered. I think if she didn't have to go, I don't think she would. And honestly, I don't think that has anything to do with what happened in the divorce or anything that Joy may be saying about him. I think Reggie just realizes that her dad is not really a great person. But unlike what he did with George, where when she basically tried to push him away, Clancy's trying to make a concentrated effort to get Reggie back. But I think Reggie realizes that a lot of the reason why George is the way that she was is because of the way that Clancy treated her when she was a kid, and she doesn't really want to have much to do with him. Moving away from the lasses, we're going to talk about George, because we get a continuation of her arc from the last episode. Thomas Hesburgh is in the newspaper in the obit section, and Daisy convinces George to go to the funeral. Daisy's convinced that George won't go on her own. And Daisy's right, she didn't go alone. She ended up taking Mason, who was kind of terrible the entire time, got a little drunk, offended a bunch of the guests, and also revealed to Tripp's sister that George and Tripp were dating and that they were boyfriend and girlfriend. Tripp and George have this weird dynamic because in the last episode we saw them talking and it seemed like there was chemistry there, but it also seemed a little bit forced. Like maybe the tension was more sexual than anything else, and that was really confirmed in this episode. Is their connection with each other is really just based on the fact that they both think that the other is attractive and they want to have sex with each other. In the beginning of the episode, George is at work and we get to see Misty again, and Misty is telling her that she thinks about sex all the time, and she even has sex at work sometimes, and asks Millie, when was the last time that you had sex? And she just kind of brushes it off like, oh, it's been a while. But they use this conversation of sex and they compare it with coffee, that coffee dates mean that you want to have sex with that person. And so they're doing all these clever metaphors with coffee and being really subtle about it. And this was a moment where we get to meet Julio, who was a character that was brought up, I believe, in season 1. Dolores had mentioned this guy named Julio who cleans out the office and how he can't even look at her when he cleans out the trash cans. And apparently Misty has also had sex with Julio. And there's this funny moment where Julio's walking by and Misty waves to him. And in the background, out of focus, you can see Dolores wave to him and he walks right by her. So it was this nice little writing moment that they followed through with, that he can't even make eye contact with her after whatever happened. At the funeral, Tripp's sister Ashley is very controlling and she does not like George at all, but George makes a big slip up and gives her last name, which Mason is very mad at her about doing. She shouldn't have said that her name was George to begin with, but she also shouldn't have said that her last name was Lass because George Lass is dead. Tripp and George end up kissing underneath the table. They get caught by Ashley. Ashley is furious and Tripp ends up leaving, and so does George to go do her reap. And I think George is kind of having this realization moment that things aren't really going to work out with Tripp. They just can't. Tripp eventually goes to the house at night with the sole intention of having sex with her. I think it's possible that he went there just because there is that sexual tension and he just kind of wanted to be around her because he liked her, and I think he's not quite sure if his feelings are romantic or if they're just carnal. And I think a lot of us have been there in that situation where we find somebody attractive and we think that something more might happen, but it's really just about whatever that raw chemistry is, and there's really nothing more than that. He tries to talk to her about what's going on in his head and the things that he's upset about, and George is not taking the bait. She flat out tells him, do you want to be there with your family or do you want to be here with me doing something fun? And he decides that he wants to be there and have fun with her, regardless of whatever that's going to mean for them. They have sex and George kind of talks about how death hit her out of nowhere. She wasn't ready for it. And then this happened and she wasn't ready for it either. But in the moment, she seemed very ready for it. And this kind of sexual awakening is very important for George as a character because she, up until this point, has kind of been discovering herself and figuring out who she is and how she wants to continue existing. And now she's figuring out that she doesn't want to just not take chances anymore. She wants to live her life. I think it's great that she is branching into other areas of her character because then she can kind of continue to experience loss in different ways. It's very clever because they originally tackled her death and her loss over that. And then they tackled her loss over her family and then over her friend Betty. And they've slowly gone into these different ways of like, George has this thing and then she loses it. And then she figures out how to cope. They follow that formula throughout the series. And in this one, they're going to use like a first boyfriend, first time, and springboard off of that with that loss. It's very clever writing. They have coffee in the morning and he says the dreaded line that you never want to hear with the hookup afterwards if you intend to hook up with them again, which is, this was fun. When you hear those words, this was fun, that means you're never going to hear from that person again, regardless of their gender, identity, or expression. Once they say, this was fun, I'll call you, it's done. And I think because they both realize afterwards, they both have this awkward tension between them. George really can't say much to Tripp. Tripp can't really say much to George. They hug each other awkwardly. And it's very clear that they both realized all it was sex. There was nothing else there. They have nothing in common. In my Dead Like Me season 3 fanfic that I was kind of drafting, I have Trip come back as a character, and I think if there had been a season 3, I think he definitely would have made another appearance to kind of throw a wrench into the system and kind of make George reevaluate that loss. There's something interesting in her outro. George talks about defying death, and the next episode's title is called Death Defying. So for Daisy, her arc is very, very, very important in this episode, or at least I think it is. I think there's a lot of hidden gems that are in it that if you really start to dissect and pull it apart, you'll find that there are some really interesting little nuggets in there. She starts out by talking about how she lost her faith, but she also says that she was just playing a part, that she's just an actress. And she gets this Reap to go to a hotel, and she decides that she's gonna dress up as a maid. So she gets there, and there's this really cute girl who is potentially a little bit too attached to her secret lover. Her name is Tess, and she's tired of being Tuesday afternoon Tess. She wants to be the wife. She wants this guy to leave his wife and his attachments and his family, and she wants him to take her away and run off with her. Again, tackling this idea of not wanting to be alone, wanting to be loved, and sexuality, all of that combined makes this particular arc really kind of encompass what the entire episode is about, because Tess doesn't want to be alone. She wants to be loved. She doesn't want to just keep having sex with this guy. She wants more. And this is a parallel to what's going on with George's story. She's hanging out with this guy Trip, and it's really just about sex. And George realizes it right away, but this girl Tess doesn't get it. And she thinks it's more than that, and she thinks it will be more than that, and she keeps forcing something to happen. She called the guy at his house, and he's furious about it, and he ends up killing her, which I know this is a common thread of things that happen in real life, of, you know, the lover killing the girlfriend. This is something that has always been just like a little bit strange to me, that he would just strangle her in the hotel and then run off, that he wouldn't like try to cover it up or anything. But Daisy was there, she was hiding in the closet, and we see her sitting in the closet just crying. And normally Daisy's very detached about people dying. Even in the last episode when there was the possibility of being in a hotel and a murder happening, Daisy was all about it. But she had a problem this time. Something else that was interesting was that Daisy shushed a graveling, and we've seen in other episodes that the Reapers don't really seem to be cognizant that the gravelings are around. Georgia really seems to be the only one who can see them or interact with them, and we'll see that even more later. But in this one, Daisy looks straight at the graveling and shushes it. Normally they can only see them out of the corner of their eye, so that was kind of an interesting little lore thing that happened, and it makes me wonder if Daisy too can also see gravelings in the same way that Georgia can, where she just sees them doing what they're doing, whereas the others are kind of less cognizant of them. So Daisy ends up fingering the murderer, and not like that. She writes down the guy's name on a little notepad and leaves it on the bedside table, but she leaves the soul at the hotel. And when Roxy gets called there for the crime scene, she finds the soul still sitting there and takes poor Tess away to go get her lights. She goes back and is furious at Daisy that not only did she leave the soul, but she also said who the murderer was. And Roxy's like, that's not your job. Your job is to get the soul and have them move on. You're not supposed to do anything else. And Daisy says everyone has their thing that they don't do. Rube doesn't do kids, which we found out in the last episode that he gets really weird around kids and when things happen to kids. And she says her thing is that she doesn't like when women are just defenseless and helpless and get attacked by some man. And Roxy comments, that didn't happen to you. Why do you have such a bug up your butt about women getting attacked? That didn't happen to you. It makes sense why Rube has a weird thing about kids, because he has an abandonment issue. He left his kid to try to take care of her somehow, and it ended up backfiring and he died. So it makes sense, but with Daisy, she died in a fire, so you would think that she would have more issues with pyrotechnics. It's very natural to be wary and to be afraid of violent men. I don't think that that's something that anybody couldn't identify with. I think especially women in general in the United States are far more likely to be wary of men, and that would be something that would be pretty triggering to them, would be seeing something like that. However, if you're undead and death is something that you see every single day, there are certain things that just kind of shouldn't bother you anymore, because as a Grim Reaper, you're sort of detached from all of that, which is why we've seen so many times where these horrific things happen. And even like with the shooting in the Lunateca episode, all the other Reapers seemed totally unbothered that there was this mass shooting happening, but George was the only one who really was bothered by it because she's never had anything happen to her like that before. And I think these characters get desensitized to certain things the more that they see it, but this is one of those things that Daisy just is not desensitized to, and it still bothers her. And in the end of the episode, when she's sitting with Mason, she is talking with him, you know, they're kind of just gabbing. They're not really talking about anything important. And she randomly brings up, have I told you that I had a sister? And this is a weird disclosure because Daisy's never brought this up before. In the season and a half that we've had her on the show, this is not one thing that she's mentioned. And in this episode where this woman gets attacked by this man and she's very triggered by it, and then she brings up her sister, this is one of the most, I think, important pieces about who Daisy is and what her character is. My personal thought is that possibly Daisy's sister either died or was harmed in some way by a man who attacked her. And I think this is something that was really triggering for Daisy at some point. Had we gotten a season 3, maybe that would have been something they could have delved into even more. But this is something that is very important to, and informs who Daisy's character is, right? Because she's sad about something. She's sad that she didn't get to do something. Maybe it was that she never got to save her sister from suffering this fate. Maybe it was because she had already died after it happened. We're not quite sure. But I think this idea of I don't do women who get attacked and did I tell you about my sister before? I think those two things are related with each other. And it's an important piece of who Daisy's character is. And I think that it's something that is worth noting, and you know, it's something that I think is important for her as a character. Tess's death is obviously really traumatic and terrible, and the writers are doing more of these kind of emotional deaths, letting us get attached to these people who die. Normally they show us characters who are kind of unlikable. When they die, it's like, we get it. Or people who don't really like, they're kind of laughing at their own situations. These types of emotional moments I think are important so that it doesn't just make the show rely on comedy. Overall, I think this episode is really fantastic, and I think there are so many things that it does well with its comparisons with coffee and how each character kind of navigates drinking coffee, but also navigates their sense of loneliness and their kind of identity in the world of how they want to be loved. And there are a lot of little subtle references throughout the entire thing that are peppered in that make the episode feel really fresh. And the continuing arcs that will go into the next episodes are really important for setting up what will happen in the remainder of the season. Favorite quote from this episode is Dolores, because she's back, and it is near the beginning of the episode where they're doing their little fake happy time death moment, and Dolores has the defibrillators and it's got cheese right in the middle of it, and she says, "There's cheese on these." Who has been making grilled cheese sandwiches with the defibrillator paddles? It's ridiculous, it's nonsensical, it's hysterical. And once again, Dolores takes the quote for the day. Thank you all so much for watching this episode. I'll see you guys on the next one.